The flood came like a thief stealing homes, silence, and breath. But in the rising chaos, one desperate mother saved the son of the richest man in town, then vanished without a name. What followed would rewrite the soul of the frontier. The skies split open that morning like the heavens had grown tired of watching in silence. It began with a strange stillness over the valley, a hush that made animals restless and sent townsfolk pacing their porches. Then came the first raindrops, fat and slow, tapping down on rusted tin rooftops and bouncing off cracked wagon paths that hadn't seen a proper storm in months. By noon, the paths were rivers, and by sunset, the town of Evershade lay half-seen under muddy, rising water. In the midst of that chaos, no one noticed the woman running barefoot through the back alleys. Her dress soaked and heavy, her hands clutching an old oilskin pouch, and the hand of a small child, her daughter, barely 4, coughing from the cold. She wasn't from Evershade, she didn't have a name in town, or any family to return to. All she had was the instinct of a mother and the urgency of someone who had nothing to lose. Her name would only be remembered later after she vanished into legend. At the highest hill in Evershade, behind the white iron gates of a sandstone estate, an entirely different world watched the storm from behind paneled glass. Inside, candles flickered against crystal chandeliers, while servants scurried through halls preparing for evacuation. And somewhere near the edge of that luxury, a boy no older than 6 slipped away unnoticed, chasing a loose ball that rolled down the muddy slope behind the estate. No one saw him disappear through the fence. No one heard his cries over the sound of rain pelting down like gunfire. And by the time the alarm rang through the manor, the water had already begun to consume the lower fields. That boy was the son of Silas Moreau, the wealthiest land baron in the county. And now, he was lost in a flood that had no mercy to give. Down in the lowlands, where old cabins leaned against fallen trees and fences gave way to current, the desperate mother was struggling to find shelter. She had taken the old orchard road, thinking the abandoned shack near the barn bridge might offer dry cover for the night, but what she found instead was the sound of something crying high-pitched, panicked, and close. It wasn't her daughter. It was a boy's voice, faint but sharp, and it came from behind the twisted roots of a tree half-sunk in the riverbank. She could have walked on, she should have walked on, but something inside her snapped wide open her memory, maybe, or just something that mothers know. She tied her daughter to a fence post with her scarf, told her to stay still, and dove headfirst into the swirling flood. She reached the boy seconds before the river did. He was caught in a gully, his ankle trapped between a branch and a rock, water rising fast around his chest. The mother didn't stop to think. She yanked at the branch, tore her own arm bloody trying to free him, then hauled the child out like he weighed no more than the coat she'd lost back in the alley. He cried out, clinging to her like she was something more than a stranger. And when she finally pulled him to higher ground, coughing water from his lungs, she didn't ask his name or wonder who he belonged to. She simply wrapped him in her shawl, placed him in her daughter's arms, and staggered toward the road with them both, vanishing into the flood-soaked forest. Before the search party ever got near, they found only footprints and a piece of red cloth. The boy was returned to his family, shaken but alive. Silas Moreau offered gold to anyone who could identify the woman, but none could. She hadn't left a name. She hadn't taken a reward. And as the town dried out and the waters receded, her story hung in the air like mist, half miracle, half mystery. Some said she was a ghost. Others believed she had died after saving the child. But one man, old Joe Mallory, who ran the feed store, swore he saw her walking west at sunrise, child on her back, vanishing down the railroad path like someone who wasn't running, but finally going home. The town called it redemption, the kind that comes not with thunder or praise, but with silence and sacrifice. But what none of them knew, what even Silas Moreau would take months to uncover, was that the woman who saved his son had once stood on his doorstep, hungry and pleading for work, and he had turned her away without even meeting her eyes. And now, the flood had rewritten everything. The morning after the flood receded, the town of Evershade woke to ruin. Chickens clung to rooftops, sodden Bibles floated between church pews, and the scent of wet wood and rot crept through every doorway like a silent plague. But in the manor on the hill, a different kind of mourning unfolded. Servants whispered behind doors. A carriage stood ready. And inside the grand parlor, Silas Moreau sat still for the first time in years, holding his son with hands that trembled. Despite their power, the boy hadn't spoken since they found him. He just stared out the window, clutching the red scrap of shawl that had been wrapped around him when the rescuers arrived. His ankle was bruised. His cheek scratched, but he was breathing, and that was more than any gold had ever bought for Silas before. No one could understand how he survived. The ridge where he was found was nearly inaccessible, the current strong enough to carry off full-grown horses, and yet, somehow, a stranger had reached him and vanished like smoke. When Silas questioned his staff, one voice, tired and reluctant, finally offered a memory. Months earlier, a woman had come to the estate gate with a child in her arms. She'd asked for work, any work. She'd said she had nursing experience, said she'd cook or clean or sew if it meant shelter. The butler had sent her away before Silas ever knew she was there. He hadn't cared then. He cared now. That night, Silas walked the grounds in silence, the wind pressing the grass flat as if even the earth bowed to what had happened. In his mind, he saw the woman his son described in fragments, dark hair soaked to her waist, arms scraped raw, a voice soft like wind through trees. She had saved his boy when wealth and servants and guards had failed, and she had disappeared with no trace, leaving him not only indebted, but haunted. Something inside Silas cracked. Not with guilt, but something heavier. Regret. What no one in town knew not yet was that Silas Marrow hadn't always been the cold man who turned beggars away. Decades ago, he was a farmhand with calloused hands and big dreams, but the land had broken him, and profit had hardened him. And somewhere in that climb, he'd learned to silence anything that didn't serve his ambition. He'd told himself he owed no one anything. Until now. The next morning, he issued a call. Posters, riders, notices nailed to trees and saloon walls. Information wanted. Woman brown. Hair approx 30. Accompanied by young girl. Saved child during flood. Reward, $10,000. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a command. He wanted to find her. He needed to, but even that effort would run cold because she had no name, no known kin, and no traceable origin. She was wind, shadow, and sacrifice wrapped in one dot, far beyond the reach of the notices. Along a dry ridge trail marked only by deer prints and wagon wheels, the mother was still walking. Her daughter had fallen asleep against her chest, wrapped tight in a canvas sling she'd torn from an old corn sack. Her own feet bled through her shoes. Her arms ached, but she moved with the steadiness of someone who knew stopping was not an option. She'd saved a life, yes, but that didn't mean hers had changed. There was no welcome waiting, no open doors ahead, only distance, and hope that somewhere far enough, she could rest without being asked where she'd come from or why she looked like she'd outrun a river. What she couldn't know was that a boy back in Evershade still clutched her shawl at night, that her name had become prayer on a rich man's lips, and that in her absence, her presence had turned the most untouchable man in the county into a father who finally understood love not as possession, but as a debt he could never repay. The flood had changed the land. But for Silas Marrow, it had done something worse. It had changed the story he told himself about who he was. 3 weeks passed. The floodwaters dried, but their memory remained in warped wood and sun-bleached lines on the barn walls. The townsfolk moved on, returning to the rhythm of wagons and windmills, but Silas Marrow did not. He turned the west wing of his estate into a private search command, lined walls with maps, hired Pinkerton men to ride routes that barely existed, and dispatched them with a command that was whispered, not spoken aloud. Find her, gently. He didn't want her brought back like a fugitive. He wanted her found like something sacred, something lost, but no bounty, no tracker, no bribe turned up more than a few dead ends. A woman fitting the description had been seen near Marrow's Gap, another near Whispering Pine. But each lead fell apart. She was always just out of reach, like the ghost of a storm. Even her name remained a mystery. And that made her harder to forget. Silas changed in those weeks. His staff noticed it first. The silence in his steps. The way he now listened before speaking. How he picked up his own son without a nursemaid's help. He even walked down to town square one morning, foot, no carriage, no guards, just him. He asked the postmaster if any letters had come in from women with no return address. He offered to cover the bill for a family who'd lost their roof. And slowly, Evershade began to whisper a different kind of story about the man on the hill. Meanwhile, far south, the mother found work in a mining town built from dust and sweat. She told no one her name, claimed to be a widow, and said little more than was necessary. She scrubbed laundry behind a boarding house and cleaned dishes at dawn, holding her child close whenever possible. Her daughter had fallen sick, nothing violent, but a deep, lingering cough that kept her awake at night and left shadows beneath her young eyes. The mother sold her only boots to buy medicine. And when that ran out, she bartered with work, with time, with dignity. No one asked about her past. In that town, no one had the time. But one night, after cleaning the barroom floor long after the saloon had emptied, she found something folded inside her apron pakuda clipping, yellowed and torn. It was the notice Silas had issued. Her face wasn't drawn, but the words were unmistakable. Saved a child during the flood. Reward. Her hands trembled as she held it. Her first instinct was to burn it. Her second was to cry. She did neither. Instead, she folded it into a square and hid it beneath the straw mattress she shared with her child. She didn't tell anyone, but that night, when her daughter coughed in her sleep, the mother whispered to the darkness, asking a question no one could hear. What would it mean to be found? Back in Evershade, Silas made one last decision. He sent word to the county paper, not with a reward but with a story. He told the editor everything. The woman, the flood, the rescue, his regrets. He didn't name himself directly, but he wrote of the man who had once denied her, and he closed the letter with a plea. If you read this and know who you are, come home. My son still dreams of you, and I owe you far more than I could ever pay. The editor didn't think twice. The next issue's headline read, "The Angel of the Flood, a county's search for the mother who vanished." The paper was mailed to every outpost, every bar, every boarding house. It arrived in the mining town 3 days later, and on the 4th day, her bed was empty. She rode in a freight wagon full of flour sacks and barrels of pickled beans, wedged between the wall and a wooden crate, holding her child close beneath a patched wool blanket. There was no plan, no letter of return, no name given to the driver, only a quiet nod and a coin dropped in his hand. The story in the newspaper had stirred something inside her that she hadn't let move in years. Not since her husband vanished, on a cattle drive? Not since she was turned away from the doors of men who measured worth by what you could give them. But the letter, the words about the boy, about regret, had cracked her silence. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even about being thanked. It was something deeper. Something no one else would ever understand unless they, too, had once been invisible. The journey took 6 days. Through ghost towns and dry riverbeds, across hills painted in dust and sorrow. Her daughter's cough had softened but hadn't disappeared. She gave her what little broth she could find and sang to her at night in the low hum of wind through wooden slats. By the time they reached the edge of Evershade County, the storm had returned not of water, but of nerves. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every fence looked familiar. Every turn ached with memory. And when the manor on the hill finally rose in the distance, white gates gleaming against the morning sun, she hesitated. Not because of fear but because of disbelief. She had once been turned away at that gate. Now she returned as someone whispered about in print and prayer. But the gatekeeper didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, startled, recognizing her from the rough description and the ragged red shawl still tied around her daughter's waist. And before she could speak, before she could explain, he opened the gate wide and said only one word: wait. Inside the estate, Silas had not slept. For weeks, every creak of the gate sent him to the window, but when the message reached him this time, "She's here," he didn't walk. He ran. And for the first time since the flood, the cold mask of his face broke into something raw. He reached the courtyard just as she stepped through the archway, child in arms, mud still on her boots. They stood like statues for a moment, the air between them too thick for breath, and though she said nothing, though not a single word passed between them, the silence said everything. He led her inside with slow, trembling steps. He called the doctor for the child. He dismissed every servant in the house. And then he did something no one had ever seen him do. He knelt, not in apology, not in penance, but in recognition. She had changed his son's life, and in doing so, had shattered the fortress around his own. The town heard of her return within hours. They came in trickles, not crowds. Bread was left at the gates, warm coats, a rocking chair with a ribbon tied to it. No one dared to intrude, but their offerings filled the courtyard like echoes of gratitude that had no words. She didn't move into the manor. She stayed in the gardener's cottage, simple, modest, quiet, but every evening, the boy she saved came to sit beside her daughter and listen to her hum. And every night, Silas watched from the window, learning what it meant to have everything and still feel like you'd only just begun to live. She didn't speak of the flood. She didn't retell the moment. She didn't need to, but in the corners of her new room, where light fell gently on worn wood, she kept the newspaper folded in four, tucked beneath her daughter's blanket. A reminder of the day someone had finally seen her. Seasons changed. The flood became a memory stitched into the town's folklore. But the woman who saved a life in the water became something more, neither ghost nor myth, but a living presence that reshaped the silence of Evershade. Her name, when finally spoken, was Miriam. No last name, no town of origin, just Miriam. It was enough. For the first time in years, her name had weight not as a beggar or a burden, but as a woman who mattered. In the cottage she had chosen, tucked near the edge of Silas Marrow's land, Miriam rose before sunrise each day, splitting firewood and fetching water before most birds had stirred. She didn't ask for help. She accepted none until it came without strings. A teacher offered books for her daughter, now bright-eyed and laughing again. A baker left sweetbread at the stoop without knocking. Even the widow Clark, once known for her sharp tongue, sent over a woven shawl stitched with warm colors that whispered welcome in ways words never could. But Miriam remained quiet, not cold, just careful. The flood had washed away much of her past, but the ache of abandonment clung to her like damp soil. She trusted the earth more than she trusted people. Except for the boy Silas's son, who began to visit her daughter daily. He came not with toys or the arrogance of privilege, but with questions. Why did leaves turn gold in the fall? Why did thunder scare the sky? And Miriam, though hesitant, answered him in stories drawn from nothing but kindness. It was he who asked her one afternoon if she had always lived alone. She paused, then simply said, "Not anymore." As the children's friendship deepened, so did Silas's quiet transformation. He no longer issued commands from the top of the staircase. He came down, rolled up sleeves, sat with farmers at town hall meetings, and asked how the land could heal, how people could be better prepared next time the river changed its mind. He no longer walked with urgency but with presence. And every evening, just before dusk, he took the long path around the orchard to pass by Miriam's garden. He never entered, he never interrupted, but she always knew he was there, watching, not to judge but to learn. One evening, an old carriage rolled into town from the state capital. A man stepped out in a tailored suit, silver watch chain catching the light, looking for Silas Marrow. He was from the county council, a representative of the governor. Word of the flood, the rescue, and the unknown woman had reached places far beyond Evershade, and the governor's office wanted to commend her with a public medal, a ceremony, and an offer of employment in the capital as a nurse for the state's orphanage board. Miriam declined. She did so without hesitation. Silas, surprised, asked her, why? She simply said, "Redemption doesn't live in marble halls." And he understood. She wasn't chasing recognition. She wasn't building a legacy. She was rebuilding a life in quiet, in dirt, in gardens where her child could grow beside another child who once called to her from the edge of death. Still, Silas felt something unresolved. So, one morning, he asked the carpenter to carve a bench, sturdy, simple, made from floodwood washed up from the old orchard fence. He placed it under the sycamore tree near the children's play area. On the backrest, a single inscription was etched into the grain: "To the woman who saw worth in a boy no one else could reach." He didn't sign it. But Miriam knew. That night, she sat on it alone, her daughter sleeping soundly, crickets rising in chorus, and for the first time since the flood, Miriam cried not from sorrow, but from release. She had been invisible once, now she was written into wood. The river ran low, the following spring. Where it once swallowed fences and wagons, it now whispered, gently over smooth stones, revealing bones of trees and rusted chains long hidden beneath its surface. Evershade was healing. The homes rebuilt, the fields replanted, and the people changed. Not because of laws or orders, but because of something softer, something quieter. One woman had bent the story of the town not with might, but with mercy, and that change could not be undone. The children grew inseparable. Miriam's daughter laughed with a brightness that belied her first days in Evershade. The boy Silas's son no longer slept with fear. Their bond stitched two broken worlds into one thread. Every day they met under the sycamore tree, where Miriam's bench stood as more than furniture. It had become a meeting place, a monument to quiet courage, a lesson carved in oak that redemption didn't wear uniforms or titles. It wore calluses and bruises and the silence of those who never asked for thanks. Silas, too, had changed, not just in posture but in soul. He no longer signed papers with a stamp and left the rest to others. He began to walk the outer fields, himself, speaking with laborers by name, sitting on porches, listening to weather talk as if it held prophecy, and though he never said it aloud, his steps often circled back to the cottage at the edge of his estate, not to intrude, but to be near the center of the grace that had transformed his world. Then one day, after the town's spring festival, something shifted again. A storm had rolled in that afternoon, but it brought no flood, just wind and hard rain. Miriam and the children had taken shelter in the gardener's shed when the thunder came, laughing at the way the roof leaked like a sieve. But then the boy collapsed. Not from illness, but from something unseen, a seizure, brief and violent. One, the doctor later said, could have taken his life had he not received immediate care. And he would have if Miriam hadn't caught it the moment it began. If she hadn't pressed his chest just so, and cradled his head, and kept him from swallowing his tongue. She had saved him again, this time not from water, but from fate. Silas wept that night. Not in public, not in pride, but in the hallway outside the boys' room. He wept not just for his son, but for the way life had forced one woman to risk so much before being seen. And the next morning, he did what pride had long forbidden. He walked to Miriam's door and asked if she would come sit with him for tea. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. But there, in the quiet of the orchard veranda, he asked if she would consider staying forever. Not in the gardener's cottage. Not as a worker, but as someone whose presence the estate, and he, could no longer feel whole without. She didn't answer right away. She looked out over the trees, her daughter chasing butterflies with the boy, and said softly, "You saw me once and turned away. Then the river brought you back to me." And that was her answer. In time, they built something new. Not a marriage, not a title, not a fairy tale, but a household stitched from respect and shared sorrow. A friendship born not from attraction but recognition. Silas gave her land of her own. Miriam gave the town a schoolhouse where no child would ever be turned away. And under the bench by the sycamore, wildflowers began to bloom without planting, without reason, as if the river had left behind more than water, as if redemption had taken root. Years later, after Silas passed quietly in his sleep, the town gathered not to mourn a wealthy man, but to honor the quiet woman who had taught him how to live. They called her the River Mother, and though she never asked for a monument, the children now grown built one anyway. Not of stone, but of a simple wooden bridge spanning the low creek at the orchard's edge. A bridge no longer needed but still walked across every day. On a brass plate screwed into the handrail were 4 words, "She carried us through." And every spring, when the rains returned and the river rose, the people of Evershade no longer feared it, because they remembered the flood not as destruction, but as the day the town was finally washed clean.